Your speaker is muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good to go? All right, super. Thank you. Okay, it's good to see you all. And we'll go ahead and get started. Get that out of there. Can you all see that? Okay. Should see an agenda. All right, so to do a map check, we are here today. On Wednesday, we'll have a Zoom and we'll do some group discussion in this forum. I'll talk more about that at the end of today. On Thursday, that group work will be due in Canvas. Again, I'll talk more about that at the end of today's session. And then looking to next week, we'll have a Zoom this time next week where we'll do a prep. I haven't figured out or haven't decided on how we're going to do that yet, but I will between now and then. And then 9 days from today, we will have our second exam. And here's our overview agenda for today. I've got some general comments I want to make, and then 2 slide presentations I'll take you through. And then I'll get you oriented to this group assignment. So that's what we're going to do today. Just got to get the rest of folks coming in. If you've just come on, you haven't missed anything major. This is all being recorded, so you can go back and see what little that you did miss up front. Okay, in terms of general comments, I've really just got 3. I just want to thank you all for your flexibility throughout this process and your patience. I can't imagine, I can't imagine because I'm going through it on my end, but definitely for you, I know there's so many more variables for you to experience than you normally do. So I just wanted you to tell you personally that I appreciate your patience and your flexibility through all this. And so anyway, to that end, my goal is to continue to get better in terms of the instruction that I'm providing you. And my focus right now is to minimize the amount of changes that I make within the week. So one of the strategies I've tried to employ is to not send you a bunch of announcements, but really to stick to Canvas. So send you a master plan for the week, but from then on, if changes do happen, number 1, try to minimize those changes. And then number 2, make Canvas the platform and make it as easy as possible for you to know what's going on and to know what changed. I have made mistakes. I'm certainly not proud of that. And a lot of times there have been times when I rely on you to kind of catch a mistake, not by design, and to tell me kind of, hey, or ask me, hey, is this what's going on or not? Case in point, close to midnight last night, somebody alerted me and said, hey, are we having a Zoom? And it was a different time. It was not what I intended. So I appreciate you all coming up on the net when you do and saying, hey, this doesn't look right to me. And like I said, we'll work our way through it. But anyway, that's where I'm at. I do want to say, if at any time throughout the week or at any time at all, don't hesitate to ask questions. So if you're like, hey, I'm not really understanding what we should do here, or what the content is or anything like that at all, it doesn't matter what time of day it is or night. If come up on the net, email me, and I will get back to you and get you an answer and take some action. So enough said on that. We'll go ahead and get into our first slide presentation about logistics today. Let me get this over here. Okay. And again, these slides are on your Canvas today, as well as this video I'll make available to you as well. So you've got a number of things. Um, First of all, I just want to double check. Somebody can type in or unmute their mic if you can see these slides, the logistics slides. So if someone can just give me a thumbs up somehow.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, super. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so driving on, Chapter 7, logistics is our focus for this week. And the main thing, right place, right time, right quantity. You can't go really wrong with that phrase. That's what logistics is all about. Two more things off the top that I like to remember. One is logistics is kind of the connective tissue throughout the supply chain. We talked about sourcing and suppliers. You know, we have items, raw materials that are at a location. We might have manufacturers downstream, and then further downstream, we might have retailers. But logistics really ties all that together from end to end. Doesn't make it better than anything else, but it's kind of like a connective tissue kind of thing. So that's one way of thinking about it. And then the last thing I would say is visualize the magnitude. And so we've done this before. We started out talking about Nike early on, and that was really the point of that exercise, was to think about the magnitude. More so, for example, Nike has locations around the world. Well, you know, what are some data points that can help us visualize that magnitude? Things like 5,000 locations, or 30% of their operation is overseas, and all those kind of things. I have found in my experience that until you start including those data points in your discussion and description, you don't really begin to visualize how complicated and potentially complex something might be. So here's our outline for today. Let me see if I can just do one better. Get this. That's, I suppose that's all right. So we're going to talk about the types of logistics, reverse logistics, and then once we get into the functions of logistics, before we do that, we need to talk a little bit about fixed and variable costs. So that'll be our outline for this presentation. So types of logistics, just very quickly, we have a couple different types before we get into really business logistics. So we'll come back to business logistics. That'll be the focus of our discussion. But I do want to highlight a couple things. One is event logistics. And I know we have a few sport management majors in our class. And I know that beyond that, the idea of event logistics might be an area that's attractive to more of you than not. This idea that you have an event that you've got to plan for, and you've got to move various types of logistics to this event. And there's a lot of logistics surrounding that event. So if you're interested in that, we have classes. We have a class here at YCP, Management 410, which is on project management. We have other classes that kind of address that, but I know event logistics is a subset of sport management, since I've talked to the sport management folks about this. And I think you could also have event logistics in terms of music production and entrepreneurship and other degrees that are not only in our class, but among the students and the warriors here at YCP. So the example we have on the screen is the CrossFit Games, which happens usually every summer. I don't know about this summer, but there's a lot of logistics, obviously, that go into that, more than just kind of a baseball game where they've got to set up the different apparatus that athletes are going to work around and compete on, and all sorts of things surrounding that event. So it's kind of fascinating to me. I get pretty excited about it. If you're excited about it too, and it's something you want to further pursue, and you want to talk about that, then you know how to get hold of me, and we can do that. Moving on, just a little bit about military logistics. obviously this is where I've spent the majority of my time here on this earth, 27 years doing this. And on the slide is various types of military logistics, everything from distribution, container delivery, humanitarian relief, all functions of water and food, and even into life support. And in the top right corner there is parachute delivery systems. So a little bit of shameless self-plug. I have a book on this. If you're really interested and you want to read more, I can send you the book for free in the electronic version. I would be happy to do that. But the point here is military has its own logistics system. We have what's called multifunctional logisticians, which is what I did for a career. So a lot of transfer here to business logistics. So an area of a lot of discussion there. Moving on to, let's talk about reverse logistics. So just in short, reverse logistics isn't necessarily taking something from the customer back. So what we have on the screen is the company called Zappos. I don't know how many of you have dealt with Zappos, but Zappos is essentially the Amazon of online shoe ordering. And Zappos came into being, I think, a few years ago. And I think the idea that Zappos really tackled and destroyed, I guess, for lack of a better term, was this idea there's no way you could buy shoes and that anyone would ever buy shoes online. Can't try them on, the sizes vary, and so on and so forth. And so what Zappos did was said, hey, we'll send it, first of all, we'll send them to you like next day delivery from the time that you order. But more importantly, if you don't like them or they don't fit, we'll take them right back. We'll pay for the shipping. We'll get you a new pair if there's a different size, or we'll refund you or whatever we have to do. And so Zappos really destroyed the idea that you could not do this online. In my opinion, they did this because they had a very responsive reverse logistics system. So that is just one example. I think what's paramount to understand in a reverse logistics system is that you don't just take the product back. Reverse logistics has to entail at least one thing, which is a reinspection of the item. So in other words, let's take these shoes, for example. Kyle out there orders these shoes and then he gets them and he's like, I don't really like these shoes after all. And so the system is there. So he, quote, sends them back. Well, the first thing we've got to do when we receive them is reinspect them. Kyle might have damaged them when he tried them on, or they might have been damaged before we sent them to Kyle. And we got to do that before we figure out what to do with them. From there, we might put them back in inventory, and so that Owen maybe orders them and we send them to him. Or maybe the damage has been done to the point to where we have to repurpose the shoes. So in other words, we have to disassemble them, take out the laces, maybe pull the raw materials apart so that we could put them back into the production process and build new shoes out of those raw materials. So the point on reverse logistics isn't just rewinding the tape. It isn't like the customer service counter that you see in Target. There's a little more to it than that. I also think that for the future of reverse logistics, we'll become into more of a sustainability thing with, as we talked about weeks and weeks ago, about sustainability and when that becomes an imperative versus a nice to do. With that will come some sort of recycling kind of thing. So that's a little bit on reverse logistics. Remember the main point, we have to at least, and the product, if we're dealing with a product, we need to at least reinspect the item before we continue on. Moving on to fixed and variable costs. And these, okay, I'm just taking a pause here. Thanks, Brenna. Let me see here. I don't know what I can do about that right now. So I'm just going to keep on going. Let me go back here. So fixed and variable costs, let's spend a moment or two here. Let's focus on fixed, for example. And these examples are in context with transportation, but we can apply fixed and variable costs to anything in business. These are just transportation examples. The main thing about fixed cost is that they are not dependent on the amount of output and the work that we do. So, for example, my favorite example with fixed costs is rent. So if we're operating a manufacturing facility and we don't own it, which most of the time we don't, we have to pay rent. And that we have to pay that rent no matter we're making 5,000 units or we're making 5 units. Either way, we have to pay rent. My wife is paying rent for her office right now and not seeing anybody in it for obvious reasons. So examples of this in the transportation function of logistics are if we're running trucks, we have to buy the truck. If we're flying airplanes, we have to buy the airplane. And if we're operating a runway, there's a certain fixed cost that we have to pay to just establish that runway. Now, variable costs are simply the opposite of that. They are dependent on the amount of work that we do or don't do. So, for example, if we have a truck, well, if we don't drive it a lot, then we don't have a lot of maintenance. But if we do drive it a lot, we do a lot of jobs, we do a lot of deliveries, we do have a lot of maintenance. So our variable cost goes up. Same thing, if we're flying a plane a lot, we have the price of airplane or the cost of airplane fuel. But if we're not, then we don't. And then same thing with roadway and runway repair. If we have a lot of planes coming in on a runway, then we've got a lot of repair costs. But if we only receive one plane a week, our repair costs and our variable costs for that runway are actually pretty low. So again, variable costs depend on the amount of output, either product or work in terms of the service industry that we perform. And fixed costs are the opposite. We're going to pay that cost regardless. And it's important to understand the difference of these when we look at the different types of transportation and the difference between these costs based on that type of transportation. So with that, we'll transfer or transition into the types of transportation. So I think the one that comes to mind the most is the trucking industry. Trucks, we see trucks all the time, or at least we used to when we were out and about. We see trucks driving down the road. We see XPO Logistics. We see Penske. All these are example of very truck-based companies in terms of moving things from point A to point B. The fixed cost is relatively low. We have a highway structure that's established. Most of that we don't have to pay for, although we do pay in the form of taxes. Truck costs are relatively low, especially when we compare them to airplanes. We'll talk some more about that in a second. And then variable costs are somewhat in the medium category. Fuel, we've got maintenance, we've got labor. Those are all variable costs, but they're still really not that high. And overall, trucking is a largely inexpensive means of transportation. again, this is dependent on a few things in terms of how quickly we want an item. But generally trucking is pretty low in terms of cost. In contrast, air is not. The minute we talk about air, even the mention we talk about the word, we use the word airplanes, for example, our costs don't necessarily go through the roof, but they go very high in comparison to other means of transportation. And the bottom line here is that air is the most expensive means of transportation of the 5 means of transportation. So the aircraft itself is expensive, handling, cargo, anything. I used to deal in former life when I worked at Strategic Transportation Command. I saw how much the tires on a C-17 Starlifter jet were. That's a lot of money. Or C-17 Globemaster. Anyway, same thing on the variable costs. So we talk about fuel, we talk about maintenance, we talk about labor. The minute we get into an air type of discussion, this is much more expensive. A little bit of kind of a trivia note that I think is relevant. So the cost of moving anything is by air is about 10 times what it is versus what it could be if we put it on a surface vessel like this. Oh, sorry. Like this. So again, during the back in 2006, 2008, I worked at the U.S. Transportation Command, and at the same time, what was going on was surge deployment in terms of troops to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And some folks call this kind of the height of those two wars. We were trying to surge forces and flood people into those areas really quickly, and so there's a lot of buildup going on. But the point there is that, at the risk of generalizing, everybody wanted everything by air. They wanted it overnight. And there was a lot of things that were flying by air that probably didn't need to fly. We saw instances of compressed air and even bubble wrap. And so as much as I didn't really like this part of the job, part of our job was to kind of find these items that were flying and kind of remind folks of how much it cost and the fact that the defense budget is not really unlimited. So back on task, here we've got a picture of a ship. And so the main takeaway here is just kind of the mad volume, for lack of a better term, that we can move. Each one of these containers is at least 20 feet long. Some of them are 40 feet long, and we can just stack containers upon containers on a ship. So while the fixed cost of a ship is nothing cheap, the variable cost is low because we spread out the amount of cargo that we can move against that cost. So we can move some crazy, serious volume, which at the same time is something to think about during the current situation. If some aspect of the surface industry is degraded, which I would bet that we can easily find a place where it is for reasons I'll talk about in a little bit, then our volume of shipping is going to be degraded as well very quickly. So, for example, when a port is inoperable for something other than coronavirus, although it could be from coronavirus, we find immediately that becomes a serious problem very quickly, because all of a sudden that volume of throughput of cargo is taken away. And so it's kind of like just shutting off a faucet that was running. So big volume to think about, fixed costs are medium, but overall, surface is the lowest cost means of transportation. remember that. Moving on to other means. Now, these last two, we probably don't think about very often unless we have a train track that's running next to our house or where we live. And when I lived in Fargo, North Dakota for 2 years, it always seemed that no matter what time of day I was going home, I always had to wait on the train because there's a big agricultural community, and that was it's kind of annoying. You get kind of used to it, but fixed costs are actually very high in comparison to the other modes of transportation because we got to lay all that track, we've got to lay all those terminals, and then we've got to purchase the train lines and the train cars and all those kind of things. And we're not, as opposed to road construction, uh, it's much harder to put a train track in place. But the flip side of that is that once we have that in place, again, very much like the surface industry, the vessel industry, we can achieve a very low variable cost. And that is because it doesn't take very many people to operate a train system. A lot of it is done by computers. And at the same time, you can transport a lot. The flip side of that is it's not a very flexible means of delivery. So whereas a lot of agriculture, and you'll usually find a port next to a port system, a seaport, you'll find a rail line, but you don't go out behind Target and find a rail line riding up to it. So you're kind of constrained by where the rail line goes. And so usually you have some sort of terminal, which is some kind of offload point. And from there, you've got trucks that take shipments and move stuff. We call that the last mile of distribution. In the military, we call that the last tactical mile. And then finally, the source is very much a horse of a different color, or the means of transportation. The fifth means of our five is a pipeline. And the obviously high fixed cost, very much like rail, the actual construction of the pipeline is going to take a while. And the thing, though, is once we get that, very much like the rail, once we get it built, our variable costs are low. We have essentially no labor costs. We don't need to man this thing. It almost goes on autopilot. We need to make sure that the ends of it are working. So the refinery, the source of the flow, and then where the flow goes, some kind of point on the end. And of course, the obvious limitation is that we're not going to move anything but liquid through a pipeline. We're not going to move finished goods or coal or any other kind of raw material for that matter, other than liquid. So that's an obvious limitation. It's very much of a functional use and not a multifunctional use. So two transportation terms to know before we kind of finish talking about transportation. And this is economies of scale and economies of distance. Now, let's see if I can do this. Okay. Get this out of the way. Okay, so first things first, economies of scale. So the simple idea here, it's really about that is not going to work real well. Well, my whiteboard is just not wanting to play ball. Try one more time. Let's do this. All right. I'm going to give up on that so that I'm not wasting your time as you're sitting there as I'm figuring this out. Let's talk about economies of scale. Truck companies don't want trucks that are not full. So we call this less than truckload, LTL. And so less than truckload is not a good thing because I'm not maximizing the capacity of my assets. And airlines don't want less than full planes either. And so that's why you see airlines doing things like double booking people. They don't they don't do that up front, but essentially that is what they do. And you think about this, how many times have you been waiting to go somewhere and you hear the person at the counter in the airport offering folks money to give up their seat because the plane is full? So airlines will fall on the side of overbooking the aircraft versus underbooking because they want to maximize the capacity, the carrying capacity of the aircraft. It just makes good business sense. They can spread that load of all those people, that income, that revenue against the cost of operating the aircraft, both from a fixed cost capacity and a variable cost capacity. Trucking companies are no different. Um, so, one thing about this is that you can have a less than truckload shipment, but someone's going to have to pay for it. And so we call this chartering. Um, so, in other words, if I have a shipment that I need delivered, and let's say it doesn't fill the truck, and I'm essentially a customer within the supply chain, and I talk to a logistics provider and I say, hey, I need the shipment tomorrow. Probably somewhere in the discussion will be, do I want to pay for the full truck? In some instances, I might be willing to pay for the full truck. It may not be articulated to me that way. They just may quote me a higher charge than I would expect to normally pay. Either way, that's probably what's happening. When I worked in the military, I would see this a lot where we would have certain types of units not want to travel with anyone else. Special forces and special operations is, I hate to say notorious, but known for this. They don't want to be on a plane with anyone else. And you see this kind of in the movies where you have all these Hollywood kind of Rambo types on a plane, this huge plane, but they're all by themselves. And that's what's going on. So they're chartering the plane and somebody is paying for the whole thing. So that's what's going on with economies of scale. To articulate it in maybe a simple way, economies of scale is we want to maximize the capacity of our transportation platform, whatever that is, whether it's a ship, whether it's a plane, whether it's a truck. And so to do that, we might have to delay shipments until we can aggregate enough cargo, whether it be people or product, so that we can maximize that capacity. That's what economies of scale is. Now, economies of distance is kind of the same, but it's still different. It's distance dependent, and it's the idea that it makes more economic sense, pun slightly intended, for me to do longer trips than a whole bunch of short trips. And I think the reasoning there is that if I'm doing a longer trip, I can that cost that I'm charging to the price that I'm charging to the customer can offset my cost. If I'm doing a whole bunch of short trips, then I'm losing, I'm not getting as much money. It has to be covered somewhere with all the download and upload that I'm doing, and I might not be able to cover that. So it makes more sense to do missions or jobs, or however way you phrase it, where I'm moving cargo, again, maxing out the capacity, but also running longer distances. So these are, again, these terms are meant for optimizing operations. If I'm in an emergency environment and I'm responding to things kind of like we are right now, these don't really apply so much. Okay, moving along. So at this point, the main thing of the presentation is to remember that logistics is more than just transportation. Although I would say that transportation is really a leading component of logistics, particularly in civilian supply chains and value chains. And 3PL is a term that you will hear quite often, and that's the third party logistics provider. What does the third party mean? Well, when we have a supplier and we have a manufacturer, the logistics, the third party logistics provider connects the two between supplier and manufacturer. Or a third party logistics provider might connect a manufacturer and a retailer, or deliver the product directly to you. It might be the same 3PL who does inbound logistics and outbound, or it might be different ones. Again, Penske and XPO are leaders within this arena, but if you go to Google and type in 3PL, you'll find virtually hundreds of 3PLs in the market today. And not all 3PLs are created equal. Some of them provide transportation. Some of them provide some of these other functions that we're about to go into. So material handling is another component of logistics that's big in the marketplace today. What's pictured here is different types of material handling. So we've got this little kind of go-kart thing that can drive around a warehouse or another facility, where we essentially manually offload boxes, or we've got automated and robotic means of material handling. And we've also got everything in between. This is a military forklift. This is actually a container handling forklift. The point of this big piece up top is to grab the top of those containers that we saw like on a surface vessel or a rail car, pick them off and move them other places, maybe onto a truck, maybe on top of another container, in a storage yard, in various places. This is kind of a side note, and I'll make it quick, but on my mind is how much, because in certain parts of the world, we have really roboticized a lot of warehouse operations, which kind of, you start to think about what could be done while labor force is reduced. And people are at home. How could operations be sustained? And is that going on in the market and industry today or not? Where are we at with that? People have written about that. So I'm just kind of curious about what is happening there right now. But I haven't seen much about that in the news or on the internet. So I kind of think that humans are a lot more involved, and we're a lot more dependent on humans in all sorts of industries than we might have thought we were. But anyway, back on track. Another function of logistics, a big function, is warehousing. Now, warehousing by itself as a functional term, in my opinion, is becoming less and less, I would say, prevalent. So warehousing to me is the idea of putting things into storage, keeping track of where they are, so that we can pull them out when they need to continue moving downstream in the value chain. But what Amazon has done is really take the concept of warehousing and expanded it. So when you look at Amazon's facilities, and I think they've got 4 of them in the Carlisle area, which is where I used to work up until a year and a half ago, they have distribution centers. This is also something we talked about with Nike. So, but Amazon really, I think, without looking it up, Amazon really captured the term of distribution facilities. And I think a lot of that is Amazon did not want to be referred to as warehouses. Because they wanted to create the idea of a multifunctional facility, meaning in plain English, we'll store things regionally in accordance where demand is most likely to happen. So we have distribution centers probably on the East Coast and the West Coast in multiple areas. But we also want the ability to distribute further down the supply chain from these places. So what you see on the left hand of this slide is kind of a warehouse type of thing, but also on the right hand slide is what we call pick, pack, and ship. So what this gentleman down here, he's picking orders all night that came in, and he's transporting them over here where they get put in those smiley face boxes and get shipped onward down the supply chain. And in my opinion, this is going to become more and more critical in the coming days, weeks, and months as people become more reliant on Amazon. I wonder how constrained they will be in terms of government and local restrictions. But I really see Amazon is going to be the primary plan for distribution even more than before. That'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Packaging, we have various types of packaging. This type on the left is more kind of packaging done in conjunction with kind of a distribution center. And then this on the right is the packaging. We have fruit in this kind of a processing plant that's being packaged for onward movement down the supply chain. Back in October, I had a chance to tour the York to the can't see the slides anymore.
That we can't see the slides anymore.
Okay, let me see here. How about now?
Still no.
No, it's still on the whiteboard.
Okay. All right. We good now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know. I don't know why that is. So here I think is maybe where we left off on packaging. So I think I was talking about York Container, and I was amazed of how many containers. And when we say York Containers, it's not one of those 20 footers. It's actually boxes, all different types of boxes that are used to package things. So that was quite interesting. So packaging is another logistics function. Different things need different type of packaging, both for functional reasons in terms of transportation requirements and handling requirements down the value chain, as well as attractive packaging. You think about rudders, you go in there and there's an attractive cosmetic need for packaging. You see this in liquor stores, things like that. But at the same time, there's a functional need because a package might be further stuffed with cargo and things like that as it moves down the supply chain. So I never knew that so much could go inside of packaging, but there's a lot of details involved. Inventory control is another function, particularly for small items and small expensive items. So when you think about weapons parts, circuit cards, specialty electronics, there's a need if you put these items in storage, which most of the time you're going to do that. Excuse me. Um, you've got somewhere the need to keep control of these items so that people don't put them in their pocket and take them home. And again, depending on the item, sometimes like a weapons part, you would definitely want to keep control of these. And then finally, kind of extending along that idea, uh, special handling and security. Again, not just weapons parts, but maybe medical files, pharmaceuticals are a big one. Handling and security is big in the pharmaceutical industry. I want to say this picture, these on the left are refrigeration. So months ago, we dealt with a storage facility that was refrigerated, Chilly Willy. So we might need refrigeration and climate control if we have some kind of really sensitive microfilm and things like that. And I think this container is like chemically treated. So we have hazardous material that could go in this. And so all these might be functions that we need or a particular value chain needs um, for their process. And finally, we talked about this back in chapter 3. What I have found by looking at third-party logistics providers is that the latest market trend pre-coronavirus is that this was kind of a differentiator in selecting a third-party logistics provider. And here's what I mean. When we're trying to connect segments of the supply chain, and we talked about integration, manufacturers, suppliers, retailers are looking for third-party logistics providers that can help them keep seamless end-to-end visibility over product as it moves. So they don't want things going into a black hole when it moves down the supply chain. And quite frankly, I don't think you do either as a consumer. So if you've ordered something, I just ordered some ink about 15 minutes before we got on today from Amazon because I've got to print all sorts of stuff for my kids. And that's now a daily requirement for all the work they've got to do at home. But we expect to see that movement as it progresses, and Amazon provides that. In my opinion, USPS, if you've ordered something from them that is going to go, you don't order something from them, but if it's going to go through USPS, you don't get that degree of both responsiveness and in-transit visibility. So I think, and from what I've read, and I think that would be even more prevalent now as we work through this crisis that we're in, is that people want visibility. Both consumers and tiers of the supply chain want that visibility throughout so they can make decisions, they can track product, they can do the things that they need to do. So enough said on that. So everybody kind of stretch out a little bit. I've got a few other things. I sure miss seeing your happy faces and all that kind of stuff, sincerely. Let's talk about a few other logistics pieces that are relevant to this that are specific to coronavirus. So we've talked about bullwhip and disruption in our course weeks and weeks ago. And, for a while, pre-coronavirus, I was beginning to really question if bullwhip is a thing in modern value chains. And here's why I say this. Most value chains of any kind of sophistication have ERP systems, they have requisitioning systems, they have communication systems, very internet and cloud based, and everybody can kind of see what's happening. And so we have the means to validate this change in demand down here before we go into a bullwhip effect. In the past several weeks, I'm starting to see the effects, I think we all have, on the coronavirus and stimulating that bullwhip. For example, I think any grocery store, retail store is experiencing that bullwhip right now, just being being stocked out of most things: bacon, hot dogs, toilet paper. Cereal's not going as fast as we thought it would. But a lot of items are making that swing. And so, folks along the distribution system are trying to figure out how to keep up with that. On the other end of things, I think conventionally we've approached disruption as something that happens in a set place. So, for example, a tsunami in Japan, labor strike in Pakistan, a line of communication or a route closed in Pakistan. And so with that model of disruption, we could say, okay, let's focus resources on that area. The challenge with the coronavirus is that disruption is really throughout because it's the virus itself. And so it's disrupting to say multiple places, it's disrupting everywhere, which makes this thing so hard to kind of figure out how we're going to work through this. A way of viewing these challenges, and I would like you to take this slide in particular as we head into the group exercise for this week. This is not the only way, but this is a way of thinking about the components that are affected. And the complexity of this is that you kind of quickly get into a chicken or the egg kind of which came first idea. So very simply, product and service, cost, and then we could split people into two areas. One is the workforce and the other the consumers. Vicus is going to like that idea of consumer. And so where, so for example, in terms of logistics and distribution, I've got a friend that his concern, he's deals with a plumbing company. He's business development. Rabbits are consumer. That's great. He's in business development for plumbing materials. And this kind of sounds like Shelby's family business. And so a little bit. And so he's concerned about how they execute distribution because people, the workforce is not its fullest capacity and people are at home. So if he can't distribute, he can't have people buying that product, and he's not going to have the revenue to pay for what he needs to do. So very quickly, these things kind of become this big mess of spaghetti that's kind of hard to untangle. But this is a way we could begin to start looking at impacts and then move on to how we mitigate that. So this slide might be helpful for your group's discussion and work throughout the rest of this week. I have included this slide because I think I would be irresponsible if I didn't. And if you understand this slide today, whether you do or not, I do think it's imperative that you eventually do. This is the slide that hopefully you've seen by now, but the idea here is that if we don't execute social distancing, like shutting down your college, at least in terms of resident in-person classes, those kind of things, then this dotted line is the healthcare system capacity. The amount of cases that we'll have on hand, will quickly overwhelm the healthcare system, and we'll have a bottleneck that we just cannot overcome. And so the idea here is that the social distancing, we're still going to have the confirmed cases, but we can flow them in. There'll be less, and we can flow them in accordance with that capacity of the healthcare system. Of course, with this social distancing strategy, it's going to impact all those value chains with that previous slide. So with social distancing, we're sending people home and not working. People aren't going out and consuming. And so that's going to impact the rest of this. And I'm not saying that any of this is right or wrong. My wife would kill me if I even implied that any of it was right or wrong. I'm just saying that, I think it's really important that you understand this slide regardless, but B, that you can take it a couple steps further to understand the impact on the value chain. And this last slide is a site that I've started within the last couple days. It's a video. It's a vlog, so it's like a blog, but a video component. I produce a video every day that's about 6 minutes long to try to get after what is the nature of these impacts that the coronavirus has had on the value chain. This is purely optional to you. I just want to put it out there. There's no black book that I'm keeping that if you watch this or follow us, you get extra credit or anything like that at all. What I'm trying to do is schedule interviews with people in industry so they can talk about impacts that they're encountering and dealing with now. I've got commitments from folks in healthcare, with some in supply chain distribution, one or two in investments, which might be pretty interesting. It's not an area of expertise at all. So if you're interested in that, again, you can go back and see this link on the video. I also have this link on my Instagram and in other places. And if you just can't find it, you can email me as well and say, hey, what was that link again? I think this information might be beneficial to you beyond the class. Of course, that's what life and being a warrior is all about, is living beyond the class. Okay, in a few minutes that we have left, and I appreciate your patience with all this. I know that sitting there and just listening to me for this long is probably not the most exciting thing in the world. I want to orient you to our assignment this week. So first things first, we would find this in Canvas. Down here when we say mandatory Zoom, and this is up. So right here, this is Wednesday, the 25th. So we will have a Zoom again. And during that Zoom, I will divide you into, I will divide the Zoom into group rooms. You'll stay in your normal group that you've known and loved and operated in to date. So no change there. I will just divide the Zoom into group rooms. And so I think that makes a little kind of Zoom within a Zoom. And you could discuss these questions that I've given you during that time. And then if you wanted to have follow-on discussion, then you could do so. Not requiring that you do so. You could do so, and I'm going to show you where that is. You could do that on the discussion board that many of you did last week. And so I've got discussion boards set up for you that are open. So for example, if you come on Wednesday, you participate in discussion, you still have some things to police up, then you could go in here and do that. But it's not required that you do. If, for example, for some reason you have to miss Wednesday and your group's discussion, then you could pick up with the discussion and contribute on that discussion board. So there's that option as well. And at the same time, if you don't want to wait till Wednesday, it's kind of like Christmas. I want to see what my group is signed up to do, and maybe get a head start. Well, then you can go ahead and do that. This is available right now. So you could start looking at that, and you could begin discussion kind of from a proactive point of view. Submissions. So the deliverable here is for your group to think about the questions that I've provided. Really, you're either looking at what is the impact on the transportation of raw materials or the distribution of finished goods. So once your group has kind of come up with the one page or on that, and there's some specifics in there on how to do that, then you would go to assignments and you would provide one submission per group. Not from everyone, but I would like you to do that in here so I can provide feedback to the group. So just to recap there, the group assignments, sorry about that. The group assignments are up on Canvas. To find those, you want to go down to our Canvas built for Wednesday here and open that up. And then you can click on your respective group's Word document and see what's the deliverable is. You could begin the discussion ahead of time if you want to. But on Wednesday, we'll Zoom in. I'll put you in the room that you, quote, belong to for your group. And you can do all the discussion right there if that's what you want to do, as if we were normally in class. If you can't make that for some reason, you could contribute to the discussion either before or after on the discussion board, give some input to your group. Somebody from your group has got to kind of compile this stuff and do one submission per group to me no later than 4:15 on Thursday. That gives you a full day beyond the end of Wednesday's session to kind of bring that home. So I appreciate you listening to all that. Does anybody have any questions? When will the SEMPO Pro be graded? My goal is to have everyone's feedback done by Wednesday. I've looked at majority of them. Some of you I've given feedback. Some of you I haven't. There's no rhyme or reason to that. But Joel, that's my goal, is Wednesday to have 100% feedback uploaded in Canvas. What other kind of questions does anyone out there have on anything? I know how this goes. Any questions at all? Once, twice. We used to do like one Mississippi count. Okay. With that, again, thank you for your flexibility and patience through all of this. And I'll look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. I'm going to go ahead and stay on for a few. You can drop off. I will post this video to Canvas later. Take care. Okay, Deshante and Drew, if do y'all have any questions or anything I can help with? Okay, Deshante and Drew, if y'all don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and drop off.